Conference organised by the World Bioenergy Association, supported by Bioenergy Europe, and with Euractiv as your media partner. I'm Mariam Zadia, and I'll be moderating today's very important event, Seeing the Wood for the Trees, the possible implications of RED III on renewable energy development and EU energy security. A big welcome to our in-person audience and of course to everyone who is registered and joining us online. Now here at Euractiv, you all know that we do love our audience getting involved in our debates. But to keep things fair, if you have a question or a comment, don't forget to put it into the Slido app. I have the iPad right here and I'll be able to see your questions when they come in. I can see things are coming in already, so do get involved. But do remember, direct your questions to a specific panelist so we know who to ask your question or comment to. Okay, well, I'm just going to kick things off by saying this. Life isn't easy right now. It's possibly a major understatement as well. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has severely disrupted the global energy market and supply chain. The cost of everything is going up. Bills are literally spiraling out of control, or they're set to in October. Things are only really getting worse for people and businesses, especially, of course, as we do now move towards winter time. Now, this week, EU politicians are mulling over all sorts of things, a whole raft of solutions aimed at easing us through this winter crisis. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, I believe, is speaking at the European Commission right now, in fact, about energy. Now, on a long-term level, the EU is doing a lot. There's a lot of innovation to try to shift away from the dependency on Russian fossil fuels and towards renewables. We have things like RePowerEU, Fit 55, just to name a few. Now, at 60% share, biomass is Europe's largest source of renewable energy. It comes from burning wood, plants, and organic matter. It's versatile and can be used to generate heat and electricity, but questions remain over its sustainability. Now, next week, we know MEPs do have an opportunity to overhaul the Renewable Energy Directive RED III at their plenary session. Secondary sustainably sourced forest biomass is under consideration under this bill, but there are some buts. Environmentalists, including people like Greta Thunberg, want MEPs to amend the legislation and remove forest biomass from the directive altogether, because they say forests are not renewable. So with that, is biomass the future, or is it a serious alternative to gas and one that has serious credentials, or is it a carbon con? Well, let's ask the experts. But before we hear from our panelists, let's set the scene with Christian Rakos, who is the World Bioenergy Association President. Please do take the floor.
Thank you very much, Marian. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this event. We've been hosting this event because we believe it's very important to lead a fact-based discussion on bioenergy, particularly in this situation ahead of the decisions that are pending. I would like to open my statement with a quote from the Club of Rome in its most recent report, Earth for All. They made a very remarkable statement saying, the most serious problem of humanity is not climate change, it's not loss of biodiversity or the pandemic, it is our collective inability to distinguish between fact and fiction. That is a serious wake-up call, I think, to rational based policymaking, and that is what we want to contribute to with this event. That is why we have invited world-class experts to talk about the burning questions about bioenergy use in the future in Europe. And I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much for being here, and enjoy the discussion.
Thank you so much. And definitely, we will be looking at the fact and the fiction, and hopefully learning a lot about biomass today. Okay, well, let's kick off this debate. We have joining us, we have Austrian MEP Simone Schmidt-Bauer, and member of the Agri Committee at the European Parliament. Welcome. We have Fanny Pom Long, She's Secretary General at the Confederation of European Forest Owners. We have John Bingham, a Special Advisor at Hawkins Wright, a biomass consultancy firm. We have Michael Obersteiner, he's the Director of the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford, who joins us online. We have Luc Pelkmans, he's a Technical Director at IEA Bioenergy, and Jean-Marc Jossard, he's the Secretary General at Bioenergy Europe. Welcome to you all. So as you can see, we have one panelist only joining us online, so that's always a good thing. Well, to understand now who all of our panelists are, what their expertise is, what they advocate for, I now invite them all to say a few words. So we'll start with our MEP. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. First of all, it's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here with you on this panel. Now I have the possibility, the chance to switch in German. It's much easier for me. Es wurde schon eingangs das wichtige Statement überhaupt begonnen. Ich komme gerade direkt von dem Europaparlament. Wir positionieren uns nächste Woche, kommende Plenarwoche, nicht nur zu einer erneuerbaren Energierichtlinie oder zur Forststrategie, sondern zu anderen sehr vielen energie- und forstrelevanten Politiken mit sehr großer Auswirkung zur Zukunft der Energieversorgung und auch der Wälder in Europa. Das große Problem, das wir momentan haben, ist, dass uns im Europaparlament der ganzheitliche Ansatz fehlt.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction. I think in the introductory statement, the most important thing was mentioned, which is the vote that we're having in Parliament next week. I've actually come just now from the Parliament, and as you know, the Parliament will be taking a position in the next plenary week, not only on renewable energy, the Renewable Energy Directive, but also on an overall EU forest strategy, including other energy and forest relevant policies, which have a great impact on the future of energy supply and forestry in Europe. And I really think that the huge problem hereby is the lack of an overall comprehensive approach.
Das kurzfristige Scheuklappendenken, das wir manchmal betreiben, leider auch viele Kolleginnen und Kollegen, anstatt mit generationenbasierten Weitblick zu agieren. Deshalb habe ich jetzt in der Fraktionssitzung der EPP darauf hingewiesen, dass wir uns ganz große Gedanken machen müssen, welche Entscheidungen wir schlussendlich nächste Woche treffen werden. Wir dürfen keine neuen Hürden, Barrieren aufbauen, sondern wir müssen den Weg in ein nachhaltiges Europa ebnen. Das ist unsere größte Aufgabe. Deshalb meine Message Nummer 1, Widersprüche in der EU-Gesetzgebung müssen unbedingt ausgeräumt werden. Es ist wichtig, die Kohärenz und die Synergien zwischen den EU-Politiken zu gewährleisten und diese auch uns dessen bewusst zu machen, denn wir können nicht auf der einen Seite ein grüneres, nachhaltiges Europa fordern und auf der anderen Seite reglementieren wir alles im Übermaß.
Often the problem in Brussels is that we have a very short-sighted and narrow view of these sorts of things, as if we had blinders on, instead of looking at things in a broad perspective based on solidarity between generations. And this is a point that I've made very clearly in our group meetings, in the EPP group in the European Parliament, looking forward to our debate next week. We don't want to set up new hurdles. We want instead to smooth the way, to pave the way towards a really sustainable future in Europe. And that's really my key message, my first key message, that we have to eliminate the contradictions in European legislation. Particularly at a time now when the future of energy, climate and forestry policy is at stake, we have to establish synergies and coherence, consistency between different areas of EU policy. We cannot have contradictions on the one hand talking about the need for a green Europe and a green future and at the same time being over-regulating everything.
Deshalb komme ich gleich zu meiner Key Message Nummer 2. Ideologie und Augenverschließen wird uns nicht weiterbringen und wird uns auch nicht retten. Denn ganz viele verstehen nicht, dass es noch keine Alternative zu einer nachhaltigen Waldbewirtschaftung und somit auch zur Holznutzung gibt. Sie haben es erwähnt, durch Putins Aggression seit 24. Februar haben sich sämtliche Rahmenbedingungen in der Europäischen Union vollkommen verändert. Und ich sage, ist nicht unbedingt immer gut angekommen, aber der Green Deal im Vergleich zu heute wurde in einer Art Luxusmodus aufgesetzt. Europa ist heute nicht mehr dasselbe wie am 11. Dezember 2019, als unsere Kommissionspräsidentin den Green Deal ins Leben gerufen und somit präsentiert hat. Heute sind wir uns einmal mehr von der Abhängigkeit Russlands, dem EU-Ausland, bewusst gemacht worden und uns droht momentan ein Zukunftsszenario einer geschwächten europäischen Wirtschaft in Kombination mit Energie- und Agrarstoffabhängigkeit. Und jeder in Europa spürt das.
That's really the basis for my second message now, which is that we cannot just close our eyes to the reality and hide ourselves behind an ideology. That's not going to save us from the present situation and the threats. Many people fail to understand that there is not, at least yet, any alternatives to the advantages of sustainable forestry management and use of wood. Particularly since Putin's aggression in Ukraine, since the 24th of February of this year, all of the conditions in Europe have changed completely. And this is a point that's not always really come across effectively. The Green Deal, the way it was first announced compared to today, has really been put into sort of a luxury mode. We see it as a luxury that we can afford to apply or not to apply depending on the conditions. But our Europe has changed. The conditions in Europe today are not the same as they were in December 2019 when European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen first presented the Green Deal. Everything has changed. We are now much more aware of the degree to which we depend on Russia and on other countries outside the EU for energy, and that's been brought home to us very painfully to feel. We are really threatened now by a future scenario of a weakened European economy in combination with dependence on energy and on other countries for energy and agrarian raw materials. Europe, I think everyone in Europe really has come to feel this pinch.
Alle, somit die Kommission, der Rat, das Parlament müssen jetzt verantwortungsvoll mit der neuen Situation umgehen und auch auf diese reagieren. Es geht nicht mehr um Punkt und Komma. Für mich und meiner Meinung nach geht es sprichwörtlich um das Ganze. Ob der Wald jetzt als nachhaltige Energiequelle, als Baustoff, als grüne Lunge unseres Kontinents, als Naherholungsgebiet gesehen wird, was auch immer. Nachhaltig bewirtschaftete Wälder sind ein wahrer Trumpf und die Antwort auf ganz viele Fragen. Und deshalb müssen wir unsere Wälder nützen. Wir schützen sie auch, das steht absolut in keinem Widerspruch. Und das Letzte, was wir jetzt tun könnten, wäre, unsere Wälder als Kohlenstoffmuseen verkommen zu lassen. Danke.
That's why all of us have to work together, particularly the EU institutions, the Commission, the Council and the Parliament have to all pull together in order to respond in a responsible way to these challenges. It's not just a question of looking at full stops and commas in an individual text in Red 3. We really have to look at the entire picture as a whole. Forestry is not just it's a source of energy, it's a source of raw materials, it's also a green lung for our continent, for the entire world, and it's also an area of recreation. We can't deny any of these aspects, but all of these have to be part of an overall sustainably managed forestry policy. That sort of policy can be a real trump, a real benefit for the EU, and it can be the basis for an answer to all the current challenges that we're facing, so that we can really work effectively towards a climate neutral economy by 2050. That's our challenge. We have to use our forests. That doesn't mean we can't protect them, and we don't have to protect them. It's not a contradiction. They can be both done at the same time. What we cannot afford to do is to let our forests turn into a carbon museum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and for injecting, you could say, that realism into the debate and talking about, a broad approach, solidarity, and also updating us on the latest from the European Parliament on Red 3. Okay, let's now go to Fanny Pom-Long. Please do take the floor for us, please. You have a few minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here to represent the voice of European forest owners. There are people like you and me. Most of them own very small forest holdings. Family forest holdings, and they are doing the best to manage their forest sustainably. I spent my holidays in my native country in France, and I could observe the impacts of the droughts on forests. Probably some of you also saw that in many countries in Europe over summer. All forests are suffering, and it was one more signal of how climate change impacts the forest. But despite this very challenging context, the forest owners community, which I represent today, they keep struggling, and they are very motivating and willing to continue to manage their forest. although the only certainty that they have regarding what's going to happen in their forest is uncertainty. And the reason why I'm saying that is, again, to keep the big picture in mind when we are discussing all this file. And I very much agree with what has been said, that we are now discussing RED today. But there are many other files now on the table that concern forest, and that will also be voted next week in Parliament. When I had the opportunity to talk with a few forest owners during my holidays, and we discussed about this EU policy making, and the reaction that I got during these discussions was really like, why, what's the point, and what's the reality, what's the link with the reality with my work? And one of the problems that I see to the big picture that we are discussing is that in the current discussion today at EU level on RED III, but also forest-related issues, is that we don't even talk about the trends that we could observe in forest over the last decades. Between 1990 and 2020, plus 14 million hectares of forest, plus 8 billion cubic meters of wood in forest, plus 48% of carbon stock in forest. And this is not totally, but partially thanks to sustainable forest management. In the current debate, we are not even discussing that. We are just focusing on dangers, risk, selling a horrible picture of what's going on in forest. Second problem is that the policy debate that we are now into, it's quite short time seeing, whereas the forestry perspective is long-term. We manage forests based on several decades. And what we are discussing now is short-term policy. So that's something also that needs to be considered in the debate. So in a context where managing forest is becoming increasingly challenging due to climate change, in a context where bioenergy is one market among others for forest owners, but in a context where we don't manage forests for energy purposes, it does not make sense. We don't plan forest management based only on energy. In a context where there are a lot of rules already in place related to sustainable forest management, nationally and regionally defined. Forest owners do not do whatever they want in their forest. In a context where heating our houses will be one of our biggest concerns in the next weeks or next months. My question, to close this statement, is what we are discussing today, and I hope we have the opportunity to come back on what is on the table today, is it in line with the reality of the ground? And I will leave it here, and I hope we can come back to the technical details of the proposal. Thank you.
We will definitely do that, don't you worry. Okay, over to our next panelist, John Bingham, please go ahead.
Good morning, good afternoon. What I would like to do is put bioenergy in Europe into some sort of context. Now, there's a tendency, I don't want to bamboozle you with figures, but there is a perception too often in the media and in the public at large that it's all about electricity, bioelectricity and wood pellets. Those are the things, and too often the image is created of dark satanic mills shoveling the remnants of murdered trees into the big boilers and
So you're telling us that's not happening?
Well, it's not what's happening. It is a complete parody of the truth. Nevertheless, it's one that has gained currency in the debate for far too long. If you look at statistically, and again, I don't want to put too many figures on for you, but electricity accounts for roughly 12% of the final consumption of bioenergy in Europe. And of that, roughly a half, less than half, is actually consumed in electricity-only utility-scale power stations. The vast majority of the biomass used in Europe is for heat and heating. And that is really the strong point and the great where the great advantage of bioenergy is to be found. If you look at the total heating and cooling within Europe, bioenergy supplies on average 19% of the total heating and cooling in Europe as an EU average. But there are some countries, and I can pick out Finland, Sweden, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Denmark. Those countries are at or approaching or have exceeded 50% bioenergy share of their heating and cooling. And there you'll find that there's large cities which are approaching carbon neutrality as a result of using biomass in CHP plants and district heating plants. And they are heating the homes of people throughout Europe. And at this time, when we're facing what's going on in Ukraine, that's massively important because they're not consuming gas. The Baltic states in particular have used bioenergy as a way of weaning themselves off Russian gas. And they did that with great foresight, as it turned out. And Lithuania I'd pick out in particular. They've got huge amounts of their heating now is coming from biomass-powered district heating and CHP plants. But there's also a lot of wood now used for heating people's homes in their own personal boilers. And that accounts for a terrific volume and supply of heat to people. So what is being proposed in the Parliament is actually drawing a line under that growth that has taken place in Europe for heating. It's drawing a line and stopping it. And ultimately, as the proposals are worded as of last night, will in due course be wound back. So all those investments and all that progress has been made in providing renewable heat to the citizens of much of Europe. In every part of Europe, there are people getting their heat from biomass and not from gas as a result of these investments that have taken place, and that's supposed to now to stop. And I find that most peculiar and a retrograde step on the part of the promoters of these policies in Brussels.
Okay, that's an interesting point to make, and definitely we will be discussing, the way in which people are heating their homes and where biomass, of course, comes into it. Thank you so much for that. Okay, we'll go to our online panelist, Michael Obersteiner. Please go ahead.
Yes, hello, welcome. Yes, so I think on the panel I'm representing the science part of it, and I have been in land use science for all of my career and also did a lot of policy work in Europe, but also globally and elsewhere. We on the science side, and me in particular, I ramped up global but also local models that feed into the IPCC assessment of 1.5 degrees. We also fed into the large biodiversity assessments globally, but also on the European scale. And another component which also speaks to European policy making is the work of the International Resource Panel, where we look at the bioeconomy and the circular economy and the feasibility of it. And what we see there is that carbon from forests actually play a huge role, not only, and this was discussed already in terms of biomass use, but also in terms of overall carbon management in order to lead to our final goals of net zero and 1.5, but also for biodiversity and in all of the material values which were also discussed already. So here what we see in all of those scenarios, for example, the global goal of reaching 1.5 degrees and the Paris Agreement without biomass currently is actually unthinkable. So here, biomass definitely, especially biomass combined with carbon capture and sequestration, is one of the key technologies we know of today to actually ensure that we reach those targets, not only technically, but also economically. And what we see is that we need to consider proper incentivizing the final outcomes we want to look at, carbon targets, biodiversity targets, material needs targets. And to my mind, and my reading is the current proposal as it sits, it actually uses command control measures rather than economic incentives and disincentives. And most importantly, what we see in our research is that it's actually the geographic differentiation of these different values, where you have, of course, you have protected areas here, but you also have biomass production there for timber production, but also for co-production for energy and other purposes. So here I think what's really needed is more science-based policy design to actually, in the end, to achieve these larger goals. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So more science. Okay, over to Luc Peltmans, please.
Okay, thank you. I would like to bring attention to what the International Energy Agency has published last year, actually before all the fuss with Russia and Ukraine. So actually they did the exercise of how can we actually achieve a carbon neutral energy system by 2050, so that the roadmap for that. And actually a main message is really that we have to start urgently. So it is really urgent to start this and to do something this decade. And we don't have the luxury to be picky. So there is different things we need to do. There's solar energy, there's wind energy, there's bioenergy, there's all kinds of options. And they're all needed. So there's no silver bullets that we can say, well, we pick this one and we don't pick that one. We all need it. And of course, with if you talk about bioenergy, you always have to look into sustainability limits. So you can't do it indefinitely. There's limits to it, but it's really needed. And they also considered the role of bioenergy then in the total by 2050 for different sectors. If you look at, for instance, the industry sector, which is quite important at the moment, about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions come from industry at the moment. Industry would rely for 15% on biomass. The transport sector, 16% on biomass, so energy in the transport sector. 10% for biomass in buildings, energy, and 5% of electricity production from biomass. So it has a role in all these sectors, and for some sectors like the industry sector, they're also quite crucial for certain sectors and applications where electrification is really difficult. A second I would like to point is the type of biomass. So I also did an exercise on, well, what are sustainable potentials of biomass. They're also quite cautious with it. So they come to a potential around 100 exajoules, which is, to put it in a picture, the total energy consumption global is 600 exajoules. So we can't do it everything, but it has a specific role. And kind of by 2050, you can divide them in three categories. First category is mainly organic waste and residues. The second category is woody biomass coming from forests, directly or indirectly. Forest, but also new forest plantings, also agroforestry. And a third is more woody and grassy crops, which you can grow on underutilized lands or in combination with current food crops. And if you then specifically look at the forest biomass, and then forest biomass without what is being used in traditional uses in developing countries, so it's now around 20 exajoules. And in this scenario, they expect that the forest biomass will increase to 30 exajoules. So it's not that we go ×5 or something for forest biomass. There is really good credentials behind it. There's realistic growth potentials behind it on how can forests be managed and better managed in certain regions of the world. So it's not an incredible amount that needs to come, but it is an important amount. If you talk about 30 exajoules, it's a lot of fossil fuels that you replace by that. I think I will leave my statement, stop my statement.
Okay, thank you so much. And then to our last panelist, Jean-Marc Chaussat, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Yeah, good afternoon now.
I'm Jean-Marc Chaussat. I'm working for Bioenergy Europe, which is the voice of bioenergy in Europe. I can only agree with my colleagues, speakers here. We are representing a major sector in Europe with more than 10% of the energy system. And in fact, we have always been in favor of sustainability criteria, because we with these criteria, we can demonstrate that our sector is sustainable and 2050 compatible, and that we can play a key role in the decarbonization. We are really convinced, and we want to demonstrate. But it's also our duty to say that, okay, when something is over-regulated or going in the wrong way, then we don't agree anymore. And this is the case with this primary biomass proposal. Why I would like to come now on the major reasons why this is coming on the table, and there are three main assumptions made by some policymakers to justify this. One, if the carbon sink. If we would avoid to extract primary biomass for bioenergy from the forest, we would increase carbon sink. This is wrong. This is wrong. The biomass, these residues will degrade anyway, and avoiding the extraction of these forest residues, logging residues typically, will not increase in the medium term the carbon stock on the forest. It's through management of the forest that we will increase, and Fanny Pom was mentioning this, with dozens of years of forest management, we have increased the carbon stock. So this assumption is wrong. Second assumption is that we would leave more material in the forest for construction. Again, sorry, I mean, there is a misunderstanding on what, or the definition, in fact, of the primary biomass is wrongly made in the current proposal, because we mix the kind of the low value residues that could be used for bioenergy and the high value wood. But in reality, even in the secondary biomass, in sawmill residues, you have higher value products that are used, for example, by the pulp and paper industry, and lower value. So if this would come through, the bioenergy companies would typically, I think, use secondary biomass and increase the competition for a lot of industries. So we reinforce the problem of this famous cascading, while these tops and branches in the forest are not used for construction as such. So again, the second assumption is wrong. And I will finalize with this third assumption, that by banning primary biomass, we make the forest more resilient. Again, it's, as Fanny Pom was mentioning, forest is under threat now with climate change, drought and storms and fire, bark beetle, you name it. So, I mean, leaving the forest untouched is definitely not making the forest more resilient. We need, and one size fits all is not also the solution. We have a lot of forests, so regulating this with such a bold measure at the European level is a strategic mistake for me. So we need, and I fully agree with what we said before, we need less emotions in this debate, more impact of the measures, and more science. Last number, if I didn't mention that before, the bioenergy sector and this primary biomass, we can easily we can have a rough estimation. This represents 40 billion, the equivalent of 40 billion cubic meters of gas. The RePower target was to save 155. So with 40, we are 1/4 of the RePower strategy. It would be a lost opportunity. Honestly, it's a lost opportunity for wrong reasons. So honestly, this is not a good idea.
Okay, so, well, let's now open up the debate then. I mean, there's been, from everything I've heard from all the panelists, there seems to actually be a lot of criticism of RED III and where biomass fits into that. So let's go to our MEP then. Talk us through the role that biomass is playing in RED III. I mean, you also, as well, talked about concerns. So where do you foresee the sort of key sticking points, especially as there's this 1 week run up to the plenary session?
Da möchte ich mit einem Beispiel beginnen, weil ich glaube, dass das alles erklärt. Ich durfte die Stellungnahme im Regionalausschuss zur RED III als EVP-Schattenberichterstatterin verhandeln. Und der einzige und der größte Knackpunkt, den wir in der ersten Verhandlungsrunde hatten, war die Biomasse. Also die Gräben waren dermaßen tief und es wurde jetzt gesagt, wir bräuchten mehr Wissenschaft und weniger Populismus. Da habe ich ein offenes Ohr dafür. Der größte Knackpunkt war die Definition von Primärbiomasse und dass sie nicht mehr förderfähig sein soll. Und im weiteren Schritt dann auch nicht mehr bei der Zielerreichung angerechnet werden soll. Im REGI konnten wir es schaffen, das waren harte Verhandlungen, aber faire und gute Verhandlungen, aber wir haben es geschafft, vielmehr konnte verhindert werden, dass diese Definitionen, die uns wirklich massiv belasten würden, sich schlussendlich im Text wiederfinden. Das war aber, und damit wir auch einmal etwas Politisches ansprechen dürfen, nur mit den Fraktionen der Renew und der ECR möglich. Für S&D und die Grünen war das eine absolut rote Linie. Da konnten wir absolut keinen Millimeter an Verhandlungen herausverhandeln, also sie haben sich keinen Millimeter bewegt. Und sie konnten auch während dem ganzen Verhandlungsprozess kein einziges Mal ihre These oder ihren Standpunkt fachlich begründen. Und deshalb würde ich mir auch in der Diskussion viel mehr wissenschaftliche Erkenntnis als Unterstützung wünschen und dass wir dem Populismus den Rücken kehren.
Thanks very much. I'd like to begin my answer with an example, which I think really makes things quite clear. Recently, I was the shadow rapporteur for the report, the opinion from the REGI committee, the Regional Policy Committee in the European Parliament, discussing the RED III proposal. And all the way from the beginning, from the very beginning, there was one major sticking point, and that was biomass. It was quite characteristic. And even in the first rounds of negotiations on the compromise text, there were really very sharp dividing lines between the different ideological camps, which made themselves quite clear. It was said just now that we have to base ourselves more on science and turn our back to populism. I couldn't agree more. I have a very open ear for that. But that's exactly what we need to do. The biggest sticking point is, in any case, the definition of primary biomass. And now the proposal is for this definition to say that primary biomass should no longer be eligible for EU support, and also that it should not be able to be taken into account in assessing progress made towards achieving our climate goals. Luckily, we were successful in the REGI committee in preventing that problematic definition of primary biomass from entering the text of our final resolution, of our position from our committee. And that, I must say, it was successful, was possible only thanks to the support that we had from the Renew Europe group and the ECR group. The other two major political groups in the Parliament, the Social Democrats and the Greens, refused to budge. They would not budge a single inch on this. It was a complete red line for them. And I must stress that they failed to back up their claims, their positions with any science, with any facts at any point in time. They failed to do so. They failed to even make any efforts in that direction. So yes to science. I'm all for science. And on that basis, I think that we can all together turn our back on populism.
Das große Problem, das wir jetzt aber haben werden und deshalb auch meine kleine Verspätung sozusagen, war oder ist vielmehr die Abstimmung, die nächste Woche im Plenum stattfinden wird, im Ausschuss ITRE. Das ist der Ausschuss für Industrie, Forschung und Energie, weil da sind alle problematischen Definitionen enthalten, die wir im REGI versucht haben und also auch geschafft haben herauszuverhandeln. Und meiner Meinung nach ein wirklich grob fahrlässiger Schritt, wenn es um Europas Energieunabhängigkeit geht. Wir haben heute erfahren, und das ist ganz frisch, dass der Deal, der ausverhandelt wurde, angeblich geplatzt ist. Das heißt, wir stehen jetzt vor neuen Herausforderungen, werden weiter verhandeln, auch über das Wochenende. Denn das große Thema war, dass ja sozusagen auf dem Level 2022 der Status quo eingefroren werden sollte. Neu ist jetzt, dass dieses Nutzungslevel von Holz auf eine Durchschnittsmenge vom Jahr 2017 bis 2022 eingefroren werden soll. Was das jetzt konkret heißt, werden momentan Experten erarbeiten und herausfinden. Heißt aber, dass der Ausbau der Erneuerbaren eingeschränkt wird, massiv eingeschränkt wird, also eingefroren wird. Und das wird sich dann mit der Quadratur des Kreises ganz einfach nicht mehr ausgehen.
The major challenge that we're facing now is the vote that we have next week in the plenary on the report from the ITRE committee. That's the Parliamentary Committee for Industry, Research and Energy. That's being voted in plenary next week. And unfortunately, that proposal is now going to plenary with that problematic definition of primary biomass still contained therein that I outlined before. That is a disaster. It's a potential disaster. It's hugely negligent as a step. It is a step in the direction of away from making Europe independent for its energy supply. We still have lots of need for discussion here, and I think that some of the positions of the groups are quite far from reality. Before, the initial proposal was that we should base any new targets on the current situation in 2022, and that should be frozen as a reference point. Now, in the new proposal going forward, they're saying that the average reference period should be an average from the years 2017 to 2022. So it's over the last 5 years. That should now be frozen as a reference point, which means that moving forward, there's going to be a massive decrease in the use and the promotion of renewable energies. You cannot raise your climate ambition at the same time as you're instituting stricter criteria for the use of biomass. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work out. It's like squaring the circle.
Okay, so from what you're saying, there seems to be lots of divisions at the European Parliament amongst the different groups of MEPs. You're saying the Greens, for example, have red lines. No one is necessarily backing it with science. So let's then go to the grand realities. And Ms. Pomlong, as we know, you represent forest management. Let's talk about it then. Are essentially forests being killed? What's going on there?
Well, I can easily answer to your question. The answer is no. But then maybe I should further develop. Yes. Well, first of all, the basics of the forest management is that nearly harvesting operations, and harvesting is not necessarily the final harvesting, and I will come back to that, leads to the production of certain type of material which are not suitable for industry due to quality and or dimension. And these operations, it can be thinning, it can be tending, it can be cleaning, it can be seedling. So all these operations, they are products that can go to energy. So now hearing what Mrs. Schmidbauer has just said, and it's breaking news. Actually, I was about to comment this 2022 cap, but now I can comment the 2017-2022 cap. It would be even worse, of course. Well, first of all, it means that it would undermine the sustainable forest management practices for the reasons that I have mentioned. Second, it would deprive the forest owners from certain economic opportunities. And I'd like here to maybe explain concretely. I started my career in the French forest sector, and again, France, 3.5 million forest owners, 2 million have less than 1 hectare. So some of them just do not or did not manage their forest because managing a forest is costly. Managing a forest, you don't get a revenue from the selling of your wood, of the final harvesting, only after investing money and time during decades. And I remember that I talked to some forest owners who explicitly explained that the bioenergy market, who back in time was starting to develop, was an opportunity for them to start managing their forests because these operations, thinnings, cleaning, which were costly and which they could not afford before, now they had the opportunity to give values to these products. So in a way to be a bit like neutral economically, so to pay these operations and to be able to do the next steps in their management. So I think this is very important to keep in mind. So if we are now sending a signal, a cap, a decrease, a phase down based on an impact assessment, we don't know when, what would be the speed of the phase down, when would it apply? Is it seriously a good signal that we send to investors, not only from the bioenergy sector, but also to the forest world? No, this is clearly not a good signal. It would lead to more tensions on the market. It would lead to also endanger the EU objectives to be carbon neutral. So yes, the consequences on the ground related to forest management, there will be consequences.
Okay, John Bingham, how about your thoughts on this then?
Yes, I think it's most most unlikely that the way the forests are managed. So the way the forests are managed is one which produces naturally forest residues. And when you're growing a forest, there are various points in the production. You've got to plant a forest, you've got to grow a forest, you've got to manage a forest, you've got to cut it down, and ultimately you're going to use the residues from the processing of the wood. So all the way through that growth cycle of a forest, there are going to be residues, and the question is how do you use them? And some of them, of course, can be used to make pulp and paper or to panel board or whatever. But there is a quite a large volume which can only really be used for energy. Either produce electricity or heat, or to produce process heat to enable the decarbonization of many industries, which now are looking for ways that will wean them off gas. If you look at the food industry, for example, the food industry, just think the dairies and the pasteurization of milk, the breweries and the brewing of beer, and all those industries such as that. They need thermal energy. They can't do it with solar power. They can't do it with heat pumps very easily anyway, certainly not efficiently. So the bioenergy is a way of decarbonizing those other industries in a most effective and cost-effective and environmentally effective way.
Right. So I think the general consensus, or at least what I'm understanding, is that all of you seem to be quite critical of this legislation. Yeah, okay, the heads are nodding. Let's go to our online panelist, Mr. Obersteiner. So let's talk about biomass then. Does it create CO2 emissions? It's not a zero carbon neutral solution, but is it more harmful than fossil fuels?
Well, this is really interesting in the sense that these kind of arguments came about, I don't know, in the last 5 years or so. And I don't know where this is really coming from, because when you look at the scientific literature, and here, we can refer back even 100 years back, we would have to rewrite all of our textbooks to actually accommodate for such claims. And also in the scientific literature, there's actually no backing from any serious paper I know of that this would actually be true. There's only the one exceptional case which probably applies more to Brazil or some other geographies, which would be more of a trade issue, which Europe is actually tackling, is if you have a permanent deforestation, then it might actually look similar to a fossil fuel emission. However, in Europe, we have forest net gain, so there's actually an impossibility that you can make this comparison. And just to finalize my argument, Europe has invested heavily into satellite systems, observing forests and ecosystems. We have national forest inventories. When you look at how the carbon and timber accounting is done on forest enterprise level, you can quantify very precisely today on any level of geographic aggregation what the carbon impact is on the atmosphere, because that's really what counts in the end. We need to solve the climate problem. And here the accounting is very clear of a renewable energy and material source such as bioenergy, which is very, very positively renewable in that sense. So from a science point of view, it's very clear, and you can actually measure it. And I think policy instruments should actually go and incentivize, as I said earlier, for a true value that the atmosphere sees, rather than making general statements about things that can actually not be backed up and not even, for sure, not be measured.
Okay, so the policy is confusing, and I'm sure that people, watching at home or here in this room, they're possibly getting a little bit confused as well. So let's talk about that then. I mean, there's going to be a lot of people wanting to switch to biomass boilers and pellet stoves. Is that a good idea right now? And especially given that people might be turning towards wood in this energy crisis. And we know that firewood, the cost of pellets, it's going up. There's a supply issue in Central and Eastern European countries. So that could then increase energy poverty, but also logging. How could all of this be tackled? Perhaps, Mr. Jossard, you could go take that question.
Yeah, there is biomass and bioenergy is an option to substitute fossil fuels. And for the moment, this is crucial, as you know. So indeed, it's normal that we might have an increasing demand, maybe temporary, for biomass. So, and biomass as a market, like which is different, which is more a local market, for sure, than without any geopolitical aspects that we have for sure for electricity and gas. But it would be a bit too much, a bit shocking to blame biomass for its success of being a fuel affordable for the energy poor. Huh? So. But yes, the market for biomass, there is a market with an offer and demand for biomass, and hopefully it's like this. And that will be with more demand in winter, lower in spring. So this is, for the moment, we are living, of course, in a very peculiar momentum. And hopefully for the whole population, for whole Europe, this will not last like this. And that's why we need to find solutions. RePower was one to substitute a certain amount. So I'm coming back to the proposal, but the current proposal will even reinforce the problem much, in fact. Because it's claimed by the GRC that primary biomass, 37% of the biomass, almost 40% of the biomass that would be out of the market suddenly. Again, you reinforce the problem rather than finding a solution. So yeah. But biomass is definitely buying for individuals and domestic, as John was mentioning, for heat production is really one solution for the energy poverty.
Very in favor.
So I was just saying that although absolutely right, the price of wood chips, residues, pellets, whatever, they've gone up dramatically. I mean, to levels we hadn't thought of before. But gas has gone up even more. And on an energy basis, if you turn it into megawatt hours of energy, the biomass is still cheaper than gas. It's cheaper than heating oil. So yes, this is a very peculiar situation we're in at the moment, but it's not going to last forever. And I think the fundamental economics of biomass as a substitute for fossil fuels will prevail.
Okay, and you wanted to go next, yep.
Yeah, just one thing to warn. I think we may have a temporary increase of people having stoves for wood, actually. But I do have to warn that, of course, there's quite a lot of old wood stoves around as well. Burning that wood in these old stoves creates quite a lot of emissions. So we have to take that into account. But instead of really saying, well, the source is bad, we have to look at, well, can we do something about the application? So can we move these applications to cleaner devices? Or maybe you can shift them to industry devices, which are happening on a much larger scale. They can implement emission reduction strategies, which is much more efficient than what you do on a smaller scale. So this is something you have to take into account as well. I think this winter will be special with these extreme high gas prices, but this is something we have to take into account as well. That maybe some of these applications are not really what we want, or we really want to move them towards the applications which are clean.
Ms. Pomlong, forest management will then be key, especially if people are trying to heat their homes with wood. But yeah, are you within your industry, are you worried about the possibility of logging?
Well, first of all, I don't represent an industry. No, it's just true, because you're not the only one, but sometimes we represent people. I think, well, several. First of all, we are in a specific momentum, and we all agree with that. About the increase of logging, forest, when you manage a forest, you don't wake up in the morning and just decide that, oh, I plan to harvest 10 trees, and oh, in the end, I will just harvest 100. It's not working like this. There is a plan. It's planned over decades, and there are rules. So you just, again, do not do whatever you want. So it's not true that suddenly forests are going to be clear-cut for energy. So there is a framework. Then what was just said before, the impact on the forest, like if what is now on the table in the parliament is voted, we see already the prices of the wood energy going up. We see some tensions on the market. Do we really believe that putting a cap or reducing or phasing down would resolve the problem? It would be even worse. So from a forest management perspective, again, I think we have to trust the expertise of those who manage their forest, their planning over decades, and the fact that actually they want to keep their forest healthy and resilient. They just want their forest to go to future generations. They don't want to destroy their forest. So we have to trust also the knowledge and expertise of those who manage the forest.
Okay, Luc Peltmans, I actually read on Twitter just before came in that you said that biomass can help with forest fires. So that's also a different element. Talk us through that.
Well, of course, it's something you have to take into account now with warming climates and also the resilience of forests, that the current forest may have issues with this warming climate, with drought, things like that, and also infestations of beetles. You see it all around, which are also related to probably to climate change. So what you also need is kind of this perspective on that there needs to be some climate adaptation as well. So we need to adapt also to climate. It also means that if you have certain forests and you're at the moment that you can harvest part of it, you have to think of how can you make them more resilient? Can you have other species here which are more drought resistant? So these are also certain opportunities also to make that change. Otherwise, you also end up with forests which are indeed increasingly subject to fire risks. We see it all around the world. And what we also saw, and we had a presentation in one of the workshops that we organized a few months ago, is that forest, which was a study about boreal forests, so in Canada, Russia, and the Scandinavian countries, it was a very clear difference that the more that forests are managed, the more there was growth in the forest, and much less was the risk, risk of forest fires. So that was really a clear difference in these regions, that through management you can actually really decrease the risk of fires.
Okay, brilliant. Now, Mr. Obensteiner, our online panelist, needs to leave our debate early. So we're going to go to, now I'll ask you to maybe wrap up, but also one thing we haven't discussed yet, of course, is capture and storage of bioenergy. So talk us through how important that will be to meeting our climate goals, and then also if you'd like to give any sort of final thoughts on the debate and what you'd like to sort of leave us all with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Well, when we look at, and I'm coming back to these 1.5 degree assessments and scenarios, there what we see is that bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, which yields towards negative emissions, is a key technology to reach these goals. Just to give you an idea, in the last 30 years, so from 2070 to 2100, the global economy will have to go net negative to the amount of the emissions of today. So this will be a major industry where we'll not only decarbonize, but we actually will have to take out CO2 on a sustainable basis for at least 30 years. This is a massive thing, and many people don't know about this, because we basically have to undo the sins which we are committing now. And here biomass with carbon capture and sequestration, but also biochar, and of course the sustainable management of the forest is a key technology to solve the climate problem. And we have to actually address this today and build these kind of industries. The other thing which is more coming out of climate science is when you look at the current emission trajectory, they are all going up. And we do know from Earth system science that we might actually trigger major tipping points in the Earth system. So for example, permafrost melting on large scales. And if we don't use all of the technologies which we are using today, in particular the negative emission technologies, very soon we might actually trigger these kind of tipping points. And so here there is real urgency also in the short term, because we are going into climate overshoot at the moment. We don't, and this was a part of the discussion, we don't have the luxury to kick out key technologies which actually needed to solve the climate problem. And so maybe here my final plea is let's really work with the facts and the observations and proper accounting on carbon and energy and so forth to actually solve the problems. And the problem I have, and this is more being an economist as well, is here we try to regulate an activity rather than creating incentive to solve problems, in particular the climate problem and the biodiversity problem, and of course also now currently the energy security and energy inflation problem. So let's solve the problems and don't debate about activities whether this or that is bad, because here we can actually measure and give scientific answers whether bioenergy qualifies or not. And this is also, as I said before, geographically also differentiated, and we have all of the technologies to do proper assessments. So let's do progressive modern policy making and not forbid things. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day as we finish our panel. Okay, I'm going to go to some questions from the audience. We have Vanessa Dimitrova. She has a question for Mr. Jossard. She says, biomass degrades, but is it still considered a hazardous waste? And are there more sustainable solutions to the use of biomass?
I'm not sure I understood the question, but the logging residues, the forest residues are degrading indeed in the forest at slower and are emitting CO2 emissions slower than if they would be used for biomass and for bioenergy, sorry. At the same time, they don't substitute fossil energy. So we have to make a balance, and this kind of the famous carbon debt aspect, which is also, that creates a lot of discussions around this, but overall it's kind of obvious that the use of the well-managed forest, sustainable managed forest, is favorable for the climate at least in the short or medium term, and obviously long term. So it's a real solution for 2050 for sure. Mm.
Okay, so just picking up on that point about biomass degrading. Perhaps, Mr. Bingham, you might want this one. So, we've been discussing sort of the merits and the demerits, you could say, of biomass. But what about the effect on industry? So, for example, the furniture makers, the wood panel industry, are we stealing their primary resource and diverting it to meet energy needs in a crisis?
The answer is yes and no. Now, I'm not being a typical economist and sort of thinking one hand and the other. It genuinely is yes and no. Yes, in the sense that bioenergy takes the lowest quality material from the bottom of the pile, as it were. The furniture manufacturers are using saw logs, and they're sort of way up the pecking order. But the ones above bioenergy are the pulp producers and the panel board producers. Mm-hmm. And yes, at the margin between very low quality wood and slightly less low quality wood, which isn't a fixed margin, it's not a fixed boundary, there is competition going on. And there is all three industries compete at the margin for that material. So the no part of the answer is that I'm not aware of any pulp mill or panel board mill that has had to stop production because it hasn't got fibre to make its product. Right. All that's happened is that they have to pay a bit more for it. And that's my answer is well, that's competition, get on with it.
Sure, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, because I think I find the wording of your question quite interesting and provocative. Stealing.
It was meant to be provocative.
So, yeah, because actually if we say that we would steal the resource and diverting it to meet energy, it would mean that the resource belongs to the industry. And actually the resource doesn't belong to the industry, the resource belongs to forest owners and managers who decide to whom they sell their wood. So the industry doesn't have the monopoly. Less, then there can be a competition, and it's a question of market, and I think that maybe it's not the question of stealing or not stealing. It's about how to make sure that we answer to the different needs that society expresses. And there are different needs. Wood material is one, wood energy in another. And I think there is a way to answer to all these needs. But it's not a question of stealing the resources, more to...
But would you say that conversation is happening right now?
About the competition? Yeah, there is a discussion on the competition. There are also some ideas that we do not support about this cascade, like whether to impose a certain hierarchy of uses, which we think is it's nonsense. So yes, it's happening. There is a market, but it's not for all types of wood. And also, I would agree that I'm not aware of any plant who had to close due to shortage of wood. So that's also something we would need to discuss.
No, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, please go ahead.
I think there's a difficulty in that bioenergy is a relatively new incomer into that space, and therefore. Some panel board producers and pulp producers felt that they knew exactly where they're going to get their material from, and it was sort of theirs. They knew that's where they're going to get it from. And then bioenergy comes along and says, hey, there's a bit of competition there, and they're having to just raise their expectations when it comes to the price they have to pay for it.
Okay, and you wanted to make a comment as well?
A quick remark on this. We should better look at the synergies among the different actors of the chains between the forest owners and the wood industries in general, because in reality the stronger the forest sector and the stronger the wood industries, the more you create synergies. And in fact, the more, to take an example, the more wood houses we will have, the better, the bigger sawmill industry we will have in Europe to replace steel and concrete, the more byproducts we will have, and the more incentives we will give to forest owners to grow more forests. So we will continue this virtuous cycle to have more forest, more wood materials, and more wood for energy, because not only for these wood industries, but also the rest of the society. So it's a kind of virtuous synergy. Whether we are completely now, some people are completely stubborn by the barriers and the nightmare and the danger, but in reality, the whole thing is the bioeconomy that is a real solution to fossil fuels. For sure.
No, and it definitely is that. Wait, I've just lost the question that I was going to ask. It's about carbon capture. Mr. Peltmans, it was actually for Mr. Obersteiner, but obviously he's left, so I'll ask you instead. James Hewitt, I don't know if interesting name. He says carbon capture and storage is not a proven technology and unlikely to be feasible other than for the largest industry applications, and particularly firewood powered stations. Is it not much wiser to oblige a reduction in carbon consumption?
Don't really understand the second point, but just on the first point about carbon capture and storage, it's actually been proven by quite a lot of it's actually related also to the fossil industries about enhanced oil recovery. So they also capture CO2 from ethanol plants, for instance, and put it under the ground. What was the main issue with CCS so far was that there was no economic incentive to do so. So if you have to pay for CCS to reduce your carbon, but there's no reward in terms of CO2 price or something, that is an issue, and that's why that's one of the reasons why things have not really taken off. We see now that new projects are taking off. Starting with demonstration projects. For instance, in Stockholm, there's a big demonstration project in their CHP where they will capture the CO2 and store it under the sea. I think close to Norway. So you will see more and more of these initiatives, and of course, this also takes a little bit of time to really get this technology spread out also. But it is taking steps, and something I want to point out, it's really because of no CO2 value actually that has really stopped for going to commercial.
Okay, we'll go to our MEP, to Ms. Schmidt-Bauer. We haven't talked too much necessarily about, real energy security. So, as we know, Russia, of course, keeps doing its maintenance on Nord Stream 1. We know the EU this week, von der Leyen, etc., they're going to make emergency interventions in the energy market to give relief to industry, to people, to avoid civil unrest, because that's also a consequence of what is going to happen, potentially. So how can the EU gain its energy security using biomass, or should we be looking at a different sort of energy mix, and what should be part of that mix?
First of all, using biomass. It's clear. Na, das ist genau das Thema, wo jetzt schon viele Vorredner die gleichen Aussagen getätigt haben. Es ist jetzt nicht die Zeit für weitere Verbote, nicht die Zeit für weitere Hürden. Wir haben jetzt einen Entwurf am Tisch liegen, der uns über das Wochenende, was die Verhandlungen betrifft, noch sehr beschäftigen wird. Aber wir haben uns schmerzlich vor Augen geführt, wie abhängig wir als Europäische Union sind. Der Ausbau der rein strombasierten Erneuerbaren kann und wird nicht rasch genug erfolgen. Das wird auch meiner Meinung nach mittelfristig nicht ausreichen. Gas- und Atomkraft sind wahrlich keine Antworten, wenn wir von einem ehrlich grünen neuen Europa reden, auch wenn die Atomkraft jetzt als grün eingestuft wurde. Das ist meiner Meinung nach ein Hohn, wirklich ein Hohn. Und wir müssen uns jetzt überlegen, wollen wir uns mit weiteren Verboten abhängiger machen oder nicht? Von wem wollen wir in der Zwischenzeit Gas, Energie abkaufen? Also von Putin nicht, da sind wir uns alle einig. Wollen wir das von anderen Autokraten haben oder wollen wir Gas aus Demokratien, die halt unterdurchschnittliche Umweltstandards forcieren und mit fragwürdigen Technologien arbeiten?
I can only reiterate the point that's just been made by the other speakers, and it's a point that I made at the beginning. This is not the right time to be introducing new bans, new hurdles. That's just a short-sighted type of thinking. We are all painfully aware in Europe, especially now, just how dependent we are on other countries outside the EU for our energy supply. And we have to end that dependency, not make it worse. So we have to be realistic. Increasing power-based renewable energies cannot keep pace with the demand, with the current challenges. Even in the medium term, that's not going to be enough. We've decided that gas and atomic energy are not the answer. I think we all agree on that. Even if some people are saying that atomic energy can be rebranded as green, it's not really green in that sense. So if we honestly want a greener Europe in the future, then we have to be responsible in taking the right sort of action. Do we want to become more dependent on other countries or less dependent? Bans, if we introduce them now, are going to make us even more dependent on people outside. And who do we want to be buying our energy supplies from? We've decided, we all agree, we don't want to be buying it from Putin. Fair enough. So who is it going to be? Are we going to be buying it from other autocratic regimes? Is that going to be the solution? Or do we want to buy gas from other democracies, but ones which are using below average environmental standards, or trying to push those through and working with questionable technologies? Those are the questions we have to ask ourselves.
Wenn es eine unabhängige, nachhaltige Zukunftsenergie im Einklang mit dem Klima geht, dann haben wir darauf bereits eine Antwort. Und diese Antwort lautet Holz. Also es führt meiner Meinung nach kein Weg an diesem biobasierten, nachwachsenden, natürlichen Rohstoff vorbei. Noch einmal, wir müssen sie nützen, wir müssen sie schützen und wir müssen, und da bitte ich alle, die Möglichkeiten auszuschöpfen in diesen Tagen jetzt, auf viele Kolleginnen und Kollegen, Entscheidungsträger zuzugehen. Wir müssen die vielen Vorteile dieser multifunktionalen, nachhaltigen, bewirtschafteten Wälder, auf das müssen wir aufmerksam machen. Vergessen wir auch nicht, wenn das Aus für Biomasse droht, was bedeutet das für den ländlichen Raum, für die Regionen, für die Menschen, die dort leben, die einen Job, ein Einkommen lukrieren. Wir reden auch immer, der Abwanderung entgegenzuwirken. Das alles würden wir momentan riskieren. Und diese kleinen Heizwerke, die größeren, die großen, die alle brauchen wir für den Übergang. Sie geben uns Unabhängigkeit und sie geben uns Sicherheit. Und das ist das, was wir jetzt momentan in Europa brauchen.
If we really want to achieve an independent, sustainable future energy supply in Europe in harmony with our climate challenges, then we do have the answer. That answer is simple. It's wood. No way can get round the need for using bio-based growing raw materials. We have to use our forests. We have to protect them as well. They go hand in hand, but we cannot just sit by and do nothing. And we have to take the challenge in the next days and weeks to approach all of the stakeholders, all of our colleagues who are in positions of decision making, and really make them aware of the challenges and of what's at stake. Let's also think, if we end the road, if we close the road to biomass, what's that going to mean for people? What's it going to mean for jobs? What's it going to mean for businesses? It's a huge risk, a risk that we cannot afford to take. So the answer is wood. It's something that we do have. We have wood being produced by smaller companies, by bigger companies. We have to make use of all of those inputs, all of that mix, because all of those sources working together provide us with what we need, which is independence and security.
Okay, so given what you're saying, just quickly, it seems as if the EU is having a sort of crisis of confidence when it comes to, what it labels as green. And I want to just bring up the Pakistan floods. I mean, I'm sure everyone's been watching the news. A third of the country submerged in water. I mean, if the EU can't turn away from fossil fuels, it can't decide, what is green, then aren't we then condemning developing nations to, well, uncertain and horrible future? Who would like to take that one?
Developed countries, I'm not sure. I just want to add something on the energy security with let's say two examples. I mean, if we take a country like Lithuania, for example, that have switched its district heating system from Russian gas to biomass, from 1 to 80% now bioenergy for district heating, we can understand that they can easily get rid and decide to stop and to ban the Russian gas. And the same is true for any kind of level of industry or individuals. I have a pellet boiler. I don't care about the gas price, I can tell you. I mean, it's a story for the others, not for me, because I'm safe. I might have to pay a bit more for the pellets next winter, but it's a story for the others. So these concrete examples are showing that yes, as this is. Bioenergy is up to 96% European energy, so the cost of bioenergy, in fact, depends more on the wages of the people. So if the wages of the people are rising, which is a good news, the biomass will rise, but it's not speculations at a much higher level that are influencing the price. So it means that further developing bioenergy is a real solution for energy security.
You'd like to go? Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
About your questions, like what if Europe doesn't know what to define,
what
what is green?
What is green, what is not?
So maybe from a forest management perspective, again, forest management is not just something written on paper. We have criteria, we have indicators, we have a clear definitions endorsed at pan-European level. So there is a way to also control and monitor, and the EU is paving the way in terms of how forests are sustainably managed. So the question now regarding these discussions on RED 3, but also on other forest-related policies is, should we, does the EU need to go further when it comes to how to manage the forest? And maybe we should already look at what we have in terms of rules at pan-European, European, national and regional level. And I don't think that we need additional rules right now.
Anyone else want to take at that point?
Well, just one point. What we're looking at is at the moment we've got to phase out coal, lignite, natural gas, and the suggestion is we actually have to phase out primary biomass as well. So we add it to the list of things that have to be phased out, and that puts 2050 net zero completely out of sight. And we're just not going to get there if we have to phase out all those four items simultaneously. Because and that's rather an arrogant and position to take when we're looking at what's going on in Pakistan. If that's where your question started.
Yeah, no, it was just literally that is, you know, a very real reminder and example right now of climate change and the fact that, you know, Europe needs to really, you know, pull up its socks perhaps a little bit, so for the rest of the world as well. There's a question from Danielle Walters. It's for all panelists, but I'll go to Mr. Peltmans because you haven't spoken for a bit. Would you consider biomass to be a transition technology, particularly for the generation of heat, whilst other renewable energies are being developed, or is it a source of energy and heat for the long term?
Well, if you look at the long-term scenarios, you see that biomass still plays a major role in 2050 and beyond. But you see that the focus is changed. So there is a transition in certain applications. I think if you look at household heating, you'll see that electricity and heat pumps will start to come into the market, and there is less focus really on individual boilers or stoves to use biomass. And then this resource, of course, then becomes available in things where you really have markets which are difficult to decarbonize or difficult to electrify. So you have specific industry sectors which need high temperature heat, for instance, where biomass comes in as very interesting. You have very efficient solutions like combined heat and power connected to district heatings, which is already interesting now. I think it will remain interesting also in the longer term. And what you also have coming up now is advanced biofuel technologies for transport fuels, specifically in the future also towards aviation fuels, which are looking for solutions. They need liquid fuels, and they can either go for biomass or for e-fuels. So you will see this shift, and it's kind of a gradual shift. So we have to face with the situation we have now. But in 10 years, it may look different with things have really come to the market and also have become cheaper for people. And you will have shifts to really markets which have a more need of a certain application than others.
Okay, lovely. Well, this debate has gone very fast. Lots has been discussed, especially about RED 3. But we are, of course, getting to the close. And so with that, I'd like you all to wrap up your thoughts. So our MEP, Ms. Schmidt-Bauer, if you'd like to take the floor.
Ja, ich habe es schon gesagt, ohne nachhaltige Waldbewirtschaftung, ohne die nachwachsende Ressource Holz wird es nicht geben. Da ist etwas, das uns zur Verfügung steht, was für uns leider manchmal auch selbstverständlich geworden ist. Und wir haben die Antwort auf viele große Herausforderungen, auf viele große Fragen. Und die Antwort für mich ist ganz eindeutig die Biomasse. Und deshalb werde ich jetzt für meinen Teil alles Menschenmögliche unternehmen, um noch viele Kolleginnen und Kollegen über das Wochenende aufzuklären. Das ist das große Manko, das wir haben. Es kann nicht jeder fachspezifisch in einem Thema so tief verankert sein, das ist ganz klar. Aber wie gesagt, die Vorschläge, die jetzt auf dem Tisch liegen, sind für mich und auch für die österreichische Delegation meiner Fraktion nicht akzeptierbar, und deshalb werden wir alles versuchen, um der Biomasse auch weiterhin eine wunderbare, nachhaltige Zukunft zu gewährleisten.
I would end with the same message, reiterating the same message I made before, which is that we need biomass. Without a sustainable forestry management policy and without wood, we cannot meet the future challenges. We have to use all available resources that we have. We have to be realistic. So we have lots of challenges, lots of problems that need to be addressed, and we have a very clear answer to many of them, and that answer is biomass. So I'm going to be spending the next days over the weekend speaking to people, speaking to businesses, speaking to my colleagues, as many people as I can reach out to, and really trying to raise awareness of what's at stake. I think that's the biggest shortcoming, the biggest lack that we have to overcome right now. Of course, not all of them can be experts in all of these fields. Everyone doesn't know all of the scientific details, but we really have to make them aware of what's at stake. And I think one thing is quite clear, that the proposals which are on the table right now are completely unacceptable for my group in the Parliament, unacceptable for the Austrian members of that group, and they're unacceptable for the future of energy supply in Europe. So we have to all work together to secure a viable and bright future for biomass. Thank you.
Interesting, and thank you also for your translation today. Okay, Fanny Pomlong, please take the floor.
Thank you. I would like to echo what has just been said, maybe that what is on the table now is really not acceptable. We will also, I think it's very important what was said, that we have still a few days to keep talking and explaining, trying to leave emotions or keep emotions a bit lower down and really talked about the facts. We usually say when we talk about the EU policy making that the Parliament is the institution representing the citizens directly. They are directly elected. I think if the MEPs, the majority of MEPs would vote in favor of those compromises which we now see on the table, it would be not only a misunderstanding from the forest owners who are represented, but from the citizens, generally speaking. It would be so totally disconnected from what they are living now. It would be a very bad signal in terms of the message sent to those who elect the MEPs. Of course, then it would not be the end of the story. There would be negotiations, but we really hope that the signal sent next week by the Parliament will be based on facts, data, and reality of the ground.
Facts, data, and reality on the ground. John Bingham, your final thoughts?
I can only agree wholeheartedly with you, and I wish you your best efforts, and I do hope you prevail. Thank you.
Sounds like you will need lots of luck, especially with those negotiations in the final days. Luc Peltmans, your final thoughts?
Yeah, maybe one point, because we didn't talk so much about the climate impact, because I think that's the base of the discussion also at the Parliament. There's a lot of misconceptions in the area. So a lot of people just look at the chimney, how much CO2 is coming from the chimneys. It can be more than fossil, but then you just neglect the whole cycle which is around it, behind it. You can just look at the forest and say, well, what's the carbon in the forest, but then you actually neglect what's the fossil fuel that you substitute. And then a lot of people just say, well, we assume that 1 hectare of forest is cut only for energy and calculate that. That just neglects the whole forestry thing. So energy is not just one single thing that you do with forestry. It's like Fanny Pom said, it's really the combination of what's the contribution of how you deal with the forests on the climate. And that is your impact on forest management. That's the impact of the forest products which are coming out. A lot of building materials can come out, and that's the energy that you produce. So it's really the combination of those, and you can't really isolate them from each other. So that's also a wrong thing, and just taking one out is a really bad idea.
Okay, interesting points there. And then Mr. Jossard.
Yeah, I think that we should be at the European policy level be proud of what was achieved so far, because if we look at the world level, really in Europe we are leading the sustainability legislation. They don't have that in the US, Japan, whatever, Africa, you name it. So it would be somehow a pity at the end of this. We have achieved something for RED II. It would be a pity to crush everything and lose complete credibility in RED III with such an extreme proposal with this primary biomass that fundamentally doesn't make sense scientifically. I mean, we have more to lose than to win. So I'm sure there are things to improve in the sustainability criteria, and we discuss things that make sense, the percentage of CO2 savings and that kind of things. That kind of things make sense. But primary biomass, it's counterproductive. We will lose the credibility for forest owners, for bioenergy, for investors, for many people. It would be a lost opportunity while we have a gold on hands. Even the food sector, the feed sector, the material sectors, they have no such legal criteria. It's just on a voluntary basis. Here we have a legal mandatory criteria for all actors. Try to make it, so that it makes sense at the end with a more common sense than emotions for the moment.
Okay, well, there definitely, I'm sure, will be more emotions in terms of protests outside the European Parliament by environmentalists. Thank you to our panellists. And now for the closing, we'll go back to Christian Rakosch. Please do take the floor, the President of the World Bioenergy Association.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the interesting contributions and for managing the discussion. If there is one single takeaway from this debate today, for me, it would be the statement of Mr. Obersteiner regarding whether bioenergy is good or bad for climate. He said there is no scientific evidence whatsoever over the last 100 years that bioenergy use based on sustainably produced bioenergy is bad for the climate. The contrary is the case. We need bioenergy to manage climate change. And the main argument of the folks that are opponents of bioenergy use is it is bad for the climate. So we're back to the reality check. We're back to the quote from the Club of Rome. Our greatest problem is our inability to distinguish between facts and fiction. It is a fiction that bioenergy is bad for the climate, and it's a fact that it is good for the climate. And I hope this has contributed a little bit to fact-based policymaking in Europe. I would like to thank you all very much for your participation. I wish you a good day and reasonable policymaking next week. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, and then just final words. Thank you to everyone, of course, who is in the room, to everyone who has been joining us online, to all of our panelists. I'm Mariam Zaidi. You've been watching a hybrid conference organised by the World Bioenergy Association in collaboration with Bioenergy Europe and, of course, with Euractiv as media partner. I hope you have the good rest of the day. Thank you, everyone. Take care and bye-bye.